With your help, we can continue to fight for freedom. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today. Simply go to tntradio.live. Talk that matters. Jerm Warfare and Jeremy Nell on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Jerm Warfare at tntradio.live. That's my email address. Thank you to everybody who does email me, and a special thank you to those who tell me where they are emailing me from. I do enjoy thoroughly the vast expansion of TNT Radio, and more specifically the breadths of the world that my show goes to. It really is wonderful. I do enjoy technology very much, at least the good aspects of it. Jump into the live chat. It's on TNT's website. What else? Oh, yes, my obligatory weather update. It is currently 15 degrees Celsius here in Cape Town at the bottom tip of the African continent. It's supposed to be spring, but it's still cold. It was raining earlier, and it just doesn't seem to want to warm up yet. The flowers are starting to say hello everywhere, but there's no sun for them, so they're all going back to sleep. Anyway, Alex, are we ready? Let's do this. My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas.
Conversations to inform and include.
It's meant for everyday people to understand.
Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
One of my favorite journalists in the world, Vanessa Beatty. Thank you for joining me again in the trenches.
Hi, nice to be back on with you.
How is, what's it, autumn now where you are?
Yeah, I suppose officially it's autumn. It's still in the high 30s in temperatures, and we haven't seen rain since April, which is fairly normal, I guess. But this summer has really been pretty unbearable, added to the no electricity, etc., etc.
Well, down here, we also have no electricity for...
I remember you told me.
A lot of the time, but we've thankfully had rain.
Yeah, I mean, we don't usually expect it until... I mean, the coastal areas tend to get some, but inland, and Damascus, of course, is inland, we don't get it until probably November time. And then we have a very short winter. Summer starts all over again in April, usually, even before sometimes.
So why do you do it? Why do you stay there? I mean, I'm guessing the cause and what you do is so much bigger than the difficulty.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel, as I always have done, whether it's with Palestine or Yemen or Iraq or any of these countries that are being not only subjugated but destroyed and pillaged by my government effectively, and of course the entire cartel of NATO member states and their hangers-on that are responsible for the devastation in these countries. So I guess when you also see the crimes that are committed against the people and you bear witness to the atrocities that are carried out, I mean, particularly here in Syria by the terrorist groups that are being deployed by the West, then it's very hard to unsee that. It's very hard to turn away and to not want to continue raising awareness about it. I mean, Syria to a large degree has kind of slipped off the edge now, right? Because you've got Africa incoming, BRICS, Ukraine since February 2022, and people have taken their attention off Syria. They haven't ever really had their attention on Yemen very much because the media just doesn't, carry any stories in relation to Yemen. And even in Palestine, I think people are sort of inured to the suffering. This is the problem. So much suffering is created globally that people do kind of switch off to it. And I guess my job is to keep prodding them and saying, no, it's still here. People are still suffering. People still need you to at least be mentally in solidarity with them, even if you feel that there's very little you can do to turn the tide of not really the governments anymore. It's those that are behind the governments that are now running the show. And in America, for example, it doesn't matter. We had Republican congressmen coming into Syria illegally last Sunday and fraternizing with terrorist groups that are sanctioned by the Democrat administration. So it really has very little to do with politics per se. It has to do with the oligarchy and the billionaire complex that are behind all of these operations to destabilize the world and to take control of resources, land, people, etc.
There is a danger, though, isn't there, Vanessa, of falling into a trap of not complacency, but I suppose defeat. You go, well, then the elections don't matter. Then it kind of leads you to saying something like, well, what's the point? And that is something that we have to avoid.
Well, no, I mean, I guess for me, I've been living now in Syria for, it'll be my 5th year next year. And I've been working here, that'll be 8 years. I was in Gaza, Palestine during the Israeli aggression in 2012, having entered by the tunnels because we weren't allowed in through the Egyptian crossing because of Zionist interference. And so for me, I tend to look at things very much through the prism of these countries. I've kind of forgotten how to look at things from a Western perspective. And so what I tend to see is that people need to accept that their political systems are corrupt and corrosive, right? They need to accept that, but they also need to accept that they can do something. This is the problem, is that people in the West have handed their power to these institutions, to these organizations, even they look to NGOs to give them a stakeholding in reducing human misery, not understanding that those very NGOs are effectively the cause of human misery in many instances. Because, of course, what are they? They are nothing more than front companies for the billionaires. They're money laundering entities for the billionaire complex, right? And they are effectively soft power in the hands of that billionaire complex to destabilize countries in advance of military intervention, either direct or proxy. And so I think I'm not saying that there's no hope. What I'm saying is that you need to make that hope exist. You have responsibility. Every single individual has responsibility to make the changes that they want to see in this world. And believe you me, I would have said the same thing 12 years ago. I would have said, well, what can I do? But I just got off my arse and I went to the places that are under attack. And slowly and gradually, I started to be able to make a tiny amount of difference just through providing information, through providing the platform for the people whose voices are being disappeared to be heard. Right? So I did something, and it was something in the beginning, very, very small. Okay. But what I'm trying to say is everyone is capable of doing something.
Exactly right.
Something. Right? And if everyone does something, it becomes many things, and it becomes powerful. It becomes energetically, spiritually, physically, something very powerful. And that's the thing. Stop giving our power. Stop looking for the savior. Like right now, everyone is Kennedy. Well, Kennedy's a die in the wall Zionist. He's not going to change anything for all of his rhetoric. He's not going to change anything. He's part of the establishment for all his good stuff on COVID, and even for the fact that he's probably the best candidate that they've got in the US. But that doesn't mean very much. The bar isn't very high, right? People need to stop looking for this kind of white savior hand to pull them out of the shit.
I agree with you. Yeah, no, I agree with you. And by the way, just this right here, this conversation is one of those things in which you can do something, because you can start shifting people's mindsets, and then that shift in mindset eventually leads to a different type of behavior.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, it is literally about individuals empowering themselves and breaking out of this gaslighting paradigm. We've been gaslighted for decades.
Yeah.
Through media, through behavior influencing organizations and experts, basically set up by the government to do this. We've been lied to.
Yep.
We've had a huge amount of wrongdoings of our various governments hidden from us for years, right? And our governments have zero accountability, zero. We pay them. We elect them. They are our employees.
And they're hypocritical. Let's segue into this very, very interesting Substack of yours, where you are talking. I guess it's a collateral conversation, because it's still about suffering, Western hypocrisy, but more specifically, human rights abuses against children. You kind of start off by mentioning the UK's head of delegation to the OSCE. What's his name? Neil Holland. And he accused Russia of human rights abuses against Ukrainian children. And in your article, you essentially turn that right around and say, "Oh, he's talking nonsense."
Well, I can't. If you read I can never get these acronyms right. The OCHCR report, there are a lot of accusations, of course, against Russia. The thing is that a lot of them have already been debunked, like the Bucha mass graves, the Mariupol mass graves. My colleague Eva Bartlett was there and actually saw the alleged mass graves, and that they were standard graves for those that had been killed in the war or even just died of natural causes. Everything that has been levied at Russia, there is a counter argument. There is a counter evidenced, substantiated claim, right? And at the end of the day, who has carried out the terrorist acts? Of course, it's the West. Whether it's the destruction of the Kerch Bridge, whether it's the destruction of the dam, they are carrying out the human rights abuses. There are mass reports of child trafficking for organ extraction. Even before the special military operation, Ukraine was basically the prostitution basket of the EU. It was well known for child trafficking, for trafficking of women, for sex prostitution in Europe, etc. So it was known as the abuse capital to a large degree. And yet all of that, and Western media was reporting on it, by the way. But all of that, like their reports on there being a neo-Nazi resurgence in Ukraine up until 2016, they were reporting it. But suddenly, post-2022, no, it all disappeared, right? And they become the good guys. They become the good guys in every single instance. And the Russians are the bad guys, exactly what they did in Syria. And the reality is, of course, what the West is doing, it's enabling and facilitating the child traffickers, the child abductors, the drug traffickers, the organ extractors to operate inside Ukraine, stealing often children from within the Donbass region that has been reunified with Russia since November 2022, and I was there for the referendum. In the same way, of course, in Syria, they levy all manner of accusations at the Syrian government and the Syrian armed forces, while they are in reality enabling and facilitating child abuse of their own nationals. This is the most extraordinary thing. Their own national children are incarcerated in northeast Syria in ISIS holding camps after they enabled the trafficking of child brides for ISIS terrorists in Syria. point in case, Shamima Begum, who was trafficked aged 15 by alleged Canadian intelligence, who enabled a trafficker to basically send child brides from the UK and from other countries to ISIS for abuse and exploitation. But the British authorities knew about this. British intelligence knew this was going on. And in my opinion, the reason that they stripped Shamima Begum of her citizenship, one, it's a political decision, but two, what is she going to say in court? What is she going to reveal in court? Even before Begum, there were multiple cases. One such case is Marzem Beg, who very early on in the war against Syria went to Syria to train the jihadis, to train the Islamist factions. When he came back, he was prosecuted. The case fell apart. Multiple cases fell apart in similar circumstances. Why? Because it would have been revealed that MI6 was facilitating both the trafficking and the passage of these Islamist military trainers to Syria. So of course it fell apart. Right.
Vanessa, just hang on. I'm going to do an ad break quickly. I'll be back with you shortly. My name is Jerm, chatting to Vanessa Beeley. This is TNT Radio.
TNT Radio's Bruce Torres.
Where were you in your life when you became aware of the sex trafficking and child abuse phenomenon in the world? And then when did you reach the tipping point of what were the first actions that you took?
I was on the Make-A-Wish board of directors when about 10 years ago, I got a call from our attorney general here in Utah. And he said, Paul, I know you've donated a lot to child-related charities. He said, I need to talk to you about something that's pretty dark. And I said, well, darker than a child dying of cancer with Make-A-Wish? I don't understand what could be worse. And he said, I'm talking about the fastest growing criminal enterprise in the world, being human trafficking, and a Homeland Security agent in Latin America who has identified a bunch of children in Colombia. And so that was the beginning of what completely transformed my life. And where was I in that world? Well, I had a multi-billion-dollar company. I was living high. I had the biggest parties at my house. I had all of the wealthy people and senators. If they didn't get invited to my parties, they were wondering what they did to make me mad. I had NBA players and whatever. And I realized, wow, I was living in this bubble. I had no idea the travesties that were going on in the world. And that's what opened my eyes.
Bruce Torres on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
All good with you, Jack?
Yeah, mate. Not bad, you know. Can't complain.
How's the farm?
Yeah, all good, all good. Yeah, that's right, Jack. All good, all good. Apart from pretty much everything. Years of drought and now it won't stop raining. Lose this crop and I could lose it all. Dad'll turn in his grave. Jess will move to the city, find a better guy, and I'll be left on my own with the dogs. Oh, it's not so bad, except once they take the farm, I'll have nowhere to keep the dogs. Mate, I just don't know how I'm going to get through this.
Yeah, I'm struggling a bit myself.
Yeah?
Yeah, but we'll pull through, mate.
Let your inner voice out at the Men's Table. Search themenstable.org for details.
If you're talking about it, we're talking about it. Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Vanessa, just quickly, you want to deal with a question from somebody, from Catherine in the live chat. She's asking to explain Zionism.
Well, I mean, I will explain it. It's not the official explanation. But I will give an example of what Zionism is. In the 1920s in Ukraine, the Republic of Ukraine, there was a leader, a president of Ukraine, Simon Petlura. Simon Petlura was responsible for some of the worst ethnic cleansing programs against not only Jews, but also against communists. And it's the communist aspect that is very important. Petlura formed a collaboration with a guy called Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was one of the early Zionist pioneers. Now, why could basically a Nazi regime form a collaboration with a Zionist organizer? Simply because both are racist, apartheid, elitist entities, secular entities. They're not connected to Judaism other than their exploitation of Judaism to achieve their agendas. Of course, in the case of Palestine, that is the appropriation of Palestinian territory, the incarceration of Palestinians in jail, the illegal detention of children, the abuse of children. In other words, a continued ethnic cleansing that didn't stop after 1948 when the Nakba happened, which was effectively enabled and facilitated by British military trainers who trained the Haganah to ethnically cleanse the towns and villages of Palestine. And that genocide, in the opinion of many, and in my opinion, has been ongoing since 1948. You will see it consistently in, for example, the Zionist bombing of Gaza. As I said, I was there in 2012 during that bombing. It wasn't, however, the worst. The worst, I think, was in 2014. But what you will always see is the deliberate targeting of entire families. So they don't just randomly target areas of Gaza. They will literally wipe out entire families in these bombings. If you go back through the victims of each campaign, which they hideously call mowing the lawn, you will see entire families wiped out in these bombing campaigns. So in my opinion, that's a continuation of the ethnic cleansing. And of course, if you look at the map of Palestine back in 1948 and look at it now, you can see that the land appropriation through illegal settlements and so on has continued pretty much unabated. Going back to the collaboration between the Nazi regime in Ukraine and the Zionist entity, you will see that that has also continued. Golda Meir was born in Kiev. The Odessa was known as the Gates of Zion. The majority of IDF leaders and even prime ministers of Israel or the occupied territories of Palestine came from Ukraine. So the connection between Ukraine and the Zionist entity has been in existence for many years. And of course, it was formed predominantly on the basis that Jabotinsky could form his own Jewish police force and Jewish militia on the basis that if there were a threat from Russia, i.e. then at that point from the communists, then Petlura's regime and Jabotinsky's militia and security forces would combine against the threat of Russia or against the communist threat. So this link between these extremist secular ideologies has been in existence for a very long time. So for me, what is Zionism? It's literally one of the most brutal ideologies on this planet.
And it is the reason why Palestinians are constantly being oppressed.
Yes, of course. Zionists, I mean, particularly Jabotinsky and Netanyahu, who's now, of course, in charge in the Palestinian occupied territories, is a follower of Jabotinsky, as was his father and grandfather. Now, this kind of Zionism believes in expansionism. So it believes in the fact that it has the right to Palestinian territory. It has the right even to more Syrian territory, because of course Israel illegally annexed the Golan territory, but they perceive that the southern regions of Syria are theirs also. And of course, even in Jordan. And in fact, I think the finance minister, Smotrich, at a recent event in Paris, I'm trying to remember when it was, I think in February, he basically showed a map of Israel showing the annexation of territory in Syria and in Jordan, which caused a diplomatic row at the time. But that gives you an idea of what Netanyahu represents, and he represents this expansionist Zionism.
So going back to what you were talking about earlier about the children, don't laugh, but how biased are media outlets like the BBC when it comes to reporting on human rights issues?
Sorry, I can't help.
Well, I guess that answers it.
Is that a serious question?
Well, I was actually trying to get an idea. I was actually trying to get an idea on human rights, on human rights abuses.
Oh, well, yeah, no, they're absolutely biased towards human rights abuses that criminalize governments that are not friendly with their own government. Look, well, media organizations nowadays really, the majority of them are packed full of spooks. So they're packed full of intelligence agents. I mean, a prime example is The Guardian in the UK, which up until 2012 still had some decent journalists, right? Including Jonathan Steele, even John Pilger, I think, was still able to write for them at that point. And then suddenly it all switched and they suddenly brought on board. I mean, I've written quite a few articles about this. People like Martin Shulov and what was his name? Karim Shaheen, who of course was allowed into Syria after the Khan Shaykhun chemical attack, when even the UN were too afraid to go into Syria to carry out their investigation. But somehow, he managed to enter amongst the head choppers and come back out with his head still on his shoulders, as did Martin Shulov on numerous occasions. And so all of these media outlets, in my view, are nothing more than an extension of their respective countries' intelligence agencies.
Yes.
I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. When I was detained for 6 hours under the Anti-Terrorist Act in my own country, in the UK, by the nature of the questioning, I knew it had been, let's say, at least enabled or triggered by the BBC, because they had been carrying out this campaign of harassment, even to the point where they carried out a sting operation against one of the academics that I worked with as part of the working group. I think you've interviewed Dr. Piers Robinson on a couple of occasions. And so the questions that were being asked could only have come from the BBC or their informants. It couldn't have come from anywhere else. Your bog standard anti-terrorist officer isn't going to have this information. So for me, these media outlets, that's what they're there for. They're there to manage narratives, to control narratives. And in the example of Ukraine, do they ever levy any human rights abuse claims against Ukraine? No. Well, it doesn't make sense, Jeremy, because even if you account for bias, there is no way in a war that the Ukraine is innocent of any human rights abuses. We know they're not, because since 2014, what have they been doing? They've been carrying out an ethnic cleansing program in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, of Russian speakers, and even targeting Russian speakers and Orthodox Christians inside Western Ukraine itself, right? So, of course they have. But suddenly, whenever you're in a escalated conflict situation, those human rights abuses get completely brushed under the carpet, right? In Kosovo, another example, in Kosovo, the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was made up of Al-Qaeda and Albanian warlords, was carrying out cross-border organ trafficking operations, abducting Serbian children predominantly and adults, and taking them across the border and basically extracting their organs. The KLA at the time was being transformed from the KLA into the Kosovo Security Corps by James Le Mesurier, who later went on, he was a former British military intelligence officer, who then set up the White Helmets in Syria. He didn't set them up in Syria, he set them up in Turkey and Jordan. And then guess what? They were accused by Syrian civilians of cross-border organ trafficking and child abduction. So the operation continued. But of course, it's not talked about. Even Carla Del Ponte, when she investigated it, she had multiple obstacles put in her way by the UN and by Western media and Western authorities and officials, because they don't want to admit that they commit crimes against human rights, right? Look at 2019, the US bombed Baghuz in northern Syria. It didn't come out until 2 years later that they deliberately dropped 2,000-pound bombs on women and children huddled for shelter by the riverbanks. They massacred them, just as they did in Iraq.
Well,
but they're not held accountable for these crimes. It's extraordinary, and yet they think that they can weaponize the ICC against their enemies. When was the last white guy held to account by the ICC?
Yeah.
Until Putin, right?
Well, that's why Putin didn't come to South Africa for the BRICS conference, because of Victoria Nuland and others were threatening the South African government with sanctions if we were to, step foot on our soil. It was. I know it was.
Yeah, I mean,
go on.
I did actually. Sorry, no, I did talk to the South African ambassador here about that. And what he basically said was, "You're quite right." He said the problem is, had they allowed him to come, then of course the opposition would have been on their back again, saying, why didn't you arrest him, etc., etc., as they have done previously, of course, when the South African government has kind of upheld the principles of international law. I mean, it's kind of crazy that these accusations are being. And I was reading through the AOC-HCR report this afternoon when I was writing this article, and they're very what's the word? They're very loose claims. I mean, you're talking a war zone. You're talking particularly in eastern Ukraine, kids that have most definitely been separated from their parents and their families, and who are living in, terrible conditions since 2014. And in my experience, when I was in Russia before I went to Donbass, I traveled to various areas, including Eastern, and I met with refugee families that had been brought out of Eastern Ukraine, some orphans, but many of them, extended families or close families with children, who were being treated like kings, I have to say. I mean, they were not living in crowded environments. And they had access to everything from food to medical care to medicines to psychological counseling. They had the option of Russian citizenship. They had the option of working in Russia even before the paperwork had been finished. They had free transport laid on for them to enable them to go from the camps. And the camps were beautiful. I mean, these were originally summer camps for kids from the local schools, right? So they're beautiful. And these families are living in little log cabins in this beautiful countryside with all the amenities. So, it just kind of beggars belief that these UN agencies are pushing through these kind of accusations with absolutely no context. That's always my problem in this. There's no context. There's no other side, right? We only ever get this kind of very black and white argument, and we're supposed to just go with that argument because the West is right and the West is good. Well, no, it isn't. The West is responsible for some of the worst human rights abuses in history, throughout its history, particularly the US and the UK, throughout its colonialist history. It's committed massacre after massacre, even against its own people. I was reading about the Peterloo riots in the 19th century, when the working class rose up against, taxes and all the rest of it, and poverty, and they were mown down by royalist soldiers. Hundreds were killed. Britain has one of the worst imperialist records. So does France. So does the US, even though it's much younger on from that perspective.
I know that when I asked you my question earlier, it sounded laughable, but there was a method to that madness, because I was actually using that to ask you what I'm about to ask you. It was a foundation for how do you think we are supposed to approach organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International?
Yeah, that's because, even for me, I struggled with using their report. Having said that, because for me, Human Rights Watch was established with George Soros money, and it was established to expand US interests globally, basically, right? It has a revolving door with the CIA. A number of its directors are former CIA. The same with Amnesty International. They are both tools for US imperialism and globalism, for sure. But are all the people working for these organizations in on it? Probably not. For example, I know in Yemen, the Human Rights Watch reporter there or team there did a pretty good job on reporting the Saudi aggression against Yemeni civilians, particularly the use of cluster bombs supplied by the US to the Saudi coalition, of course. And there has been at least one other incident when the US pulverized Raqqa under the pretext of fighting ISIS. In reality, the Kurdish Contras were giving the coordinates of civilian infrastructure and residential areas to the US as another ethnic cleansing program by the Kurdish Contras and the US in Syria. But basically, Raqqa was pulverized and hundreds, if not thousands, of civilians were killed and many more wounded and displaced. Now, at that point, and I'm trying to remember the name of the Amnesty person that did the report, but the report was not bad. It did actually expose the US crimes. It did expose the excessive use of artillery and bombing to fight ISIS. And of course, the interesting thing, the US was claiming, well, yes, we're bombing hospitals because ISIS have taken control of the hospitals. And yet, when the Syrian army says the same thing, no, you can't say that. You're bombing hospitals, right? This is the hypocrisy of the West. The same in Mosul in Iraq, by the way. Thousands of civilians were killed in the so-called liberation campaign there.
Do you remember?
And so, yeah, I just want to say, like, you have to tread with caution. But the fact is that this human rights report of what happened and what happens in the Northeast to these British, American, EU nationals and their kids that are being held in the ISIS detention camps correlates with the evidence that I had already received from journalists that I considered to be half decent, who had gone to the same area and interviewed families and met with the children prior to the Human Rights Watch report. So while I go through it kind of very carefully, if I feel that it's justified and if it's based on human testimony, then you can use it. But I think you just always have to be aware if there's an underlying bias or an underlying agenda that aligns with the Western agenda in whichever region or country that you're covering.
I was going to ask you if you remember a particular incident, but I'll ask you that after the break. Vanessa, my name is Jerm. This is TNT Radio.
Climate change debunked in just 20 seconds. You gotta hear this.
From Washington, D.C., this is the Morano Minute with your host, TNT Radio's Mark Morano.
Georgia Tech climatologist Dr. Judith Curry, a guest of mine on TNT Radio, also appeared on Fox News this week and laid waste to the entire climate emergency agenda in just 20 seconds. Here is climatologist Dr. Judith Curry.
It's been characterized as a very simple issue, as if carbon dioxide emitted from fossil fuels is some sort of a control knob on the climate. Well, it just flat out isn't. Sure, humans are influencing the climate to some extent, but natural climate variability is far and away the dominant factor.
And there you have it. CO2 is not the control knob of the climate, and humans can influence the climate, but natural climate variability rules. The data bears this out. Don't fall for the climate emergency, climate crisis narrative. This is Mark Morano for the Morano Minute on TNT Radio.
Before I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I thought all the people that I knew who didn't drink were self-righteous people, holier than thou. So it never occurred to me that Alcoholics Anonymous was filled with people who had drank like I did, and now were the same people that I used to drink with. The same people that I liked, only now they weren't drinking. They were people just like me who had been drinking for a long time and found out that it didn't work for them anymore.
Visit AA.org for more information and download the Meeting Guide app to find a meeting near you.
TNT, You're with Jeremy Nell on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
I was going to ask you before the break if you remember that incident. I think it was, Vanessa, in 2016 or 2015 when Obama, the great US president who won the Nobel Prize for Peace, let's never forget that. He authorized one of, I think, 26,000 shellings in the Middle East just in that year alone. And one of them was of a Red Cross Children's Hospital. And a whole bunch of people were killed, including doctors and kids. Yeah. And then he goes on TV and he just says on TV, I'm sorry, guys. And then life went on.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in the same year, 2016, September. So that was still the Obama administration. Basically, I think it was Danish, UK, maybe even Australian and US aircraft bombed Syrian Arab Army positions on a mountain near Deir ez-Zor, which at that point was under the occupation of ISIS. And by bombing this position and killing more than 100 Syrian Arab Army soldiers, and by the way, although they claimed it was a mistake, they turned around and then machine gun strafed them after they had bombed them, so they killed the survivors. The mountain was then retaken by ISIS, which gave them the strategic position overlooking Deir ez-Zor. So, there are many instances of the US basically providing air power or a no-fly zone for ISIS inside Syria.
Vanessa, do you think that that public opinion, particularly across the Anglo-American Western sphere, do you think public opinion perhaps is starting to change? And are people realizing more and more that Western exceptionalism is a hoax?
Yes, I think for me, public consensus started to change around 2016 with regards to Syria after the liberation of Aleppo, because the media had been lying for years about, human rights abuses and the starvation of civilians. And then when it all fell apart, even the UN basically vindicated what myself and a couple of other journalists like Eva Bartlett had said from on the ground. And from then on in, I think people developed a very healthy distrust of what media outlets like the BBC or CNN or, The Guardian, The Times, etc. were saying. Then, of course, we had the COVID project. And I think, again, that awoke a lot of people to the manipulation by their governments, the predator class power grab that was going on, and the subjugation of the working class, etc. And then, of course, we had the Russian special military operation in February 2022, so hot on the heels of COVID. And actually, I would argue that COVID was almost in preparation for this, so that it became very easy for people to vilify Russia after they vilified each other basically over COVID and not being vaccinated, etc. Right? But I think what has happened, with the banning of RT, with the banning of Russian media, the banning of Iranian media, the banning of just about anything that doesn't comply with Western narratives, the Marot for its kill list in Ukraine, for example, that basically is a hit list. It's a NATO-managed hit list for any journalists or dissidents that are going against the Kiev Nazi-linked regime. People have really started to understand, maybe not in its entirety, but I think they have certainly developed a healthy mistrust of mainstream media. The BBC viewer figures or audience figures is dropping dramatically, and they're kind of scratching their heads as if to say, well, I wonder why that is. Perhaps because you lie pathologically. So, yes, I do think, I guess I could ask you the same thing. You must be seeing an increase in your audience. You must be seeing an increase in the traffic to media sites that are offering alternative views or conspiracy theories, as they so love to dismiss it as. And even the fact that we're seeing these incredible global fires across the world that as who was it? Dr. David Martin described as basically a land grab by the various states, and that's what fire has historically been used for. The Ministry of Defense in the US during the Vietnam War commissioned a report using forest fire as a weapon in Vietnam. And the report also took into consideration various other countries and even areas of the United States. So this is nothing new. I think what is difficult for people is discerning exactly
That's right.
what the truth is.
I've got a few theories on that. Nassim Taleb, who sadly got the whole COVID thing completely wrong, but he wrote a really good book a number of years ago called now I've gone blank. Skin in the Game. There we go.
Glad it happens to you as well.
Skin in the Game. And he basically made the argument that when it comes to trusting people or putting faith in groups or organizations, it's about risk. And I have used that thinking to a large degree, particularly throughout this whole, as you called it, the COVID project. I love that phrase. I'm going to use it, the COVID project. Here's what he said basically. Put more faith or a higher degree of trust in those who've got skin in the game, those who've got more to lose. You, for example, you live in Damascus, right? You are in Syria. You're not paid by CNN or the BBC, right? You are an independent journalist. You have a lot to lose if you get things wrong. People simply won't trust what you say anymore. Whereas if CNN gets it wrong, they can just put a little disclaimer saying, sorry, we got it wrong. And then nothing happens to them and they carry on. They don't have skin in the game. So my rule of thumb is to put more faith or put more trust in people like you, those who have got more to lose. And that is how I find myself navigating or filtering through the media, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And I think, you're absolutely right. I mean, we sort of touched on this on a little chat on Telegram that, the craft of journalism is actually being lost, because what is journalism, in my opinion? It's being on the ground in the places that you're talking about, right? That is journalism to me. That is, I grew up with John Pilger and Robert Fisk and guys that actually went to where they're reporting from. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be telling the truth, because the BBC often, they were embedded in Iraq. They came to Syria on multiple occasions, but they basically lied. And we know that they lied because in certain instances, for example, Eva Bartlett was at the same place as the journalist from the BBC. And yet her report was diametrically opposed to the one that the BBC put out, because the BBC blamed everything on the Syrian government, while in reality it was the terrorists bombing the area they were in. But, ultimately we do put our lives at risk, whether it's here in Syria on the front lines, whether it's Eva in Donbass on the front lines. And as such, then to a degree, of course, we have a bias, because I always hear people saying to me, yes, but you can't be objective because, you're reporting only from the Syrian government-held territories. And well, of course I am. If I go into Idlib city, my head isn't going to be still on my shoulders, or I'm going to be raped or tortured. It's kind of ridiculous to say that. The only people who can enter these areas are the media entities that are aligned with those terrorist groups. Right, we've seen that multiple times, whether it's Alex Crawford of Sky News, Martin Shilov of The Guardian, etc. I can't enter there. Why? Because I inherently oppose terrorism. I inherently oppose imperialism. I inherently oppose my government's human rights abuses in the name of democracy. That is my bias. But ultimately, what do? I only transmit the voices of the Syrian people that are not being heard, because they are being disappeared by Western media in the attempt to control the narrative. So my job, Eva's job, the job of all journalists who go to these marginalized regions or countries is to transmit the opinion of the people who are not being heard, who are being silenced, who are being erased from public consciousness in the West.
Those with skin in the game.
Yes, exactly. I'm not brave. The people who have lived through nearly 13 years here in Syria of a Western imposed terrorist war against their very existence. Those are the brave people, and those are the people that I want to be heard, not me. My voice is irrelevant, but my opinion is based on their opinion largely, and my own analysis from on the ground, which you can't compete with outside. You can do good analysis. I'm not saying you can't. But when you're on the ground, the complexities and nuances that come into your analysis can't be interpreted from outside the country. They can't.
I mean, Vanessa, I don't really agree. I think I'd rather trust Anderson Cooper than you. No, I'm kidding.
Oh, God, dear old Anderson. He always reminds me of Max Headroom. I don't know if you're old enough to remember Max Headroom.
No.
Look him up.
I will.
Look it up. It was kind of this weird animated, it was probably early AI talking head. Look it up because it even looks like Anderson Cooper.
But he does look like a cartoon character anyway, Anderson.
Yeah, he does. A lot of them do, Our Damon, for goodness sake. Okay, she was on the ground, but she should have received an Oscar for her acting here in Syria. I've done a whole documentary exposing. Literally, they set fire to an entire oil refinery in Homs and then filmed themselves running alongside it, claiming to be sniped and bombed and all the rest of it. It's hilarious. But yeah, she definitely deserves an Oscar. She doesn't deserve any kind of Pulitzer Prize, that's for sure.
Well, time is now running against us, so let's quickly promote your work. How can I follow you?
Well, the best place is my Substack, as you mentioned early on. I've just written or finished off the article today about the Western hypocrisy while they condemn their own children, so British nationals, US nationals, EU nationals, to a life of abuse in northeastern Syria while pointing the finger at Russia. Twitter, of course, Telegram. I still do have just about my YouTube channel. Those are the main ones, really, and Patreon.
Someone in the comments is asking if you know of Patrick Lancaster, who's in Ukraine.
I know of him. I've never had the pleasure to meet him. I think Eva Bartlett, who spent a lot more time in Donbass than myself. I only went there once for the referendum so far, although I'd like to go back. She's met most of the on-the-ground journalists. There's also a very good French lady journalist, Christelle Neant, Neant, who's Donbass Insider. She does a fantastic job reporting from there also. There's a lot of good people on the ground in Donbass. Also, an American journalist, George Eliasson, who's actually lived in Luhansk. He's fantastic. Since, I think, 2012. He's married to a lady from Luhansk, and his work is outstanding. I love him.
Vanessa Beeley, God bless you. Thank you for joining me in the trenches.
No, thank you so much. Take care.
Take care, Vanessa. It's always a pleasure chatting to you, Vanessa. I can't wait to chat to you again. I wanted to talk to you actually a bit about horses, because you have the best horses on your side of the world, but we'll do that next time. Thank you.
I look forward to it.
Yes. Thanks, Alex.
You should come to one of the horse shows here one time.
I will try my very best, Vanessa. Okay. Thanks, Alex, for keeping everything going. Up next is Steve Hook. Yeah, that's right. And my email address is jermwarfare@tntradio.live. I almost completely butchered my outro. I forgot everything I was supposed to say. Anyway, I'm out here. I'll catch you tomorrow. My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas.